Welcome back to Indomitable Interactive's Indie Highlight. This week I'm going to talk about Fashion Police Squad from Mopeful Games and published by No More Robots. Fashion Police Squad is a boomer shooter according to Steam, but I beg to differ. To be fair, it is a self-proclaimed humor shooter, so before I get into why it's not a boomer shooter, I must talk about how creative and purely ridiculous this game is. There are so many references and little jokes littered here and there within the game's absurd premise, and that may be my favorite thing about it. You play as an officer in the titular Fashion Police Squad, and you enforce the fashion rules of Trendopolis. I like to imagine that the entire idea of the game came from someone joking that rather than FPS standing for first-person shooter, it stood for Fashion Police Squad, and then made an entire game on that one quip. The gameplay mostly consists of navigating a fairly linear city and furiously fixing fashion felonies. Different enemies require different weapons, which include a paint shotgun, a sewing machine gun, sock gnomes, a water cannon, a wardrobe rocket launcher, and of course, the Belt of Justice. The paint shotgun helps fight drab colors, and its secondary function can help tone down overwhelming neon clothes. The sewing machine gun, also known as the tailor-made, helps fix baggy clothes and has a secondary function that can help tight clothing as well. Sock gnomes work as a throwable item that will take socks away from the socks and sandals wearing tourists. The Belt of Justice serves many functions, but as far as enemies go, it is used for those who wear sagging pants, and Karens, of course. The water cannon is a multi-use weapon, but it's mainly for people that dress like Guy Fieri and talk like Beavis. Finally, the outfit rocket launcher can take out giant crowds of enemies, but has a limited ammo of 4. The belt and water cannon are also required for some platforming sections. As I said, this game is just ridiculous, from the weapon and enemy ideas to the dialogue and setting, and in this department I love this game. I can't quite put into words how dumb, but in a good way, this game is, so for that feeling alone, I suggest checking it out. But outside of that, the gameplay is something I'd really like to pick apart and look at, because while I think it works well, I do have some big problems with it. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, this game is not a boomer shooter, it is something I would call a strategy shooter. For reference, I would refer to something like Doom Eternal as a strategy shooter. I would say this because certain enemies are particularly weak to certain weapons or utilities, like the Cacodemon having a very large health pool but dying to a sticky bomb immediately. I should point out that I staunchly dislike Doom Eternal for this and numerous other reasons. I do think that this kind of gameplay can work, but seeing it in a Doom game does not sit right with me. Nonetheless, this is not a review of Doom Eternal. Enemies in Fashion Police Squad can only be killed with one particular weapon, although later in the game some enemies get an additional weakness. On a small scale, especially in the beginning of the game, this is perfectly manageable and enjoyable. When there is only 2 or 3 types of enemies in any given area, it is still like a normal fast-paced shooter, except you just have to give it a little more thought. Planning out which enemies you'll take down first, or what order you'll switch between your various weapons can be a fun gameplay mechanic, but it gets out of hand fast. Maybe this is just me and I don't like strategy shooters, I'm not sure. Switching weapons every few seconds is simply not that fun when I'm being overwhelmed by a lot of enemies, which makes the game harder to scale up in difficulty. If you look at genre-defining classics like the original Doom and Doom 2 or their successor Quake, you'll notice that they have 1 or 2 guns that stand out above the rest. Doom 2 famously has the super shotgun, which is so handy that it is most players' go-to weapon. You'd switch to the chain gun for something far away and then ramp up to a plasma gun or even BFG for big targets. But if I walked into a room with a lot of different types of enemies, I would most likely clean them all up with the super shotgun. In Quake, my go-to is probably the super nail gun or again the super shotgun. This formula works and you can see it in successful boomer shooters today like Dusk. The dual-wielding shotguns are a lot of fun to use and will be a solid go-to for the majority of the game. Not having this go-to weapon is not inherently bad, although I do find myself switching to the tailor-made when outside of combat despite that it is not particularly better than any other weapon. Circling back to how it can be hard to scale up difficulty with this kind of system, the difficulty curve in this game was brutal, at least in my experience. Playing on Fashion is My Passion, which is only the second of 4 difficulties, I went from breezing through levels to dying a few times in level 9 and beyond. While dying a few times does not immediately make a game too difficult, frustration does. A game, in my opinion, is too difficult if frustration outweighs fun, and the reward of finally winning doesn't feel rewarding after your previous failures. With that idea in mind, I should say that I got legitimately frustrated at the game in later levels. When you have rooms of a dozen enemies at a time, and there are a multitude of different types of enemies that require different weapons, it's immediately overwhelming. Combine that with what is often a smaller space, and you have no breathing room. Constantly switching between weapons while getting pummeled is not all that fun. This is the line where strategy shooters break for me, but it could be made better if not for some of the enemy behaviors. The goal of a game, to be as simple as possible, is to progress. I would argue that a defining feature of boomer shooters is being relatively fast-paced. The player character in Quake, for example, runs at a ridiculous pace. This means that the game is designed to progress rapidly. Rarely does it lock you in a room other than boss fights, or have enemies that specifically impede your movement. These closed-off rooms can be done well and are still seen in these genre-defining classics, but they need to serve a purpose. They can be a challenging boss fight, have a story purpose, or just add a little difficulty to a level within reason. Having too many in a single level is problematic in my opinion, as they specifically slow down progress and thus the quick flow of action. On this topic of slowing down the flow of action, some of the enemies are designed poorly for this exact reason. I seriously love the idea and visual design of every enemy in the game. They're all super creative and genuinely humorous, but gameplay wise, a few do annoy me. In particular, the tourists. Although it's not that I have much of a problem with the enemy itself, but instead the weapon I must use against them, the sock gnomes. Throwable items can be done correctly in old school shooters, but this is not how. A great example would be the grenades in Prot. Not only are they a secondary function, meaning you do not have to switch them, but they also explode on impact, unlike a lot of grenades in other games. Switching to the throwable item combined with the slow rate I can throw them at really slows things down. It doesn't help that the socks and sandals enemy requires 2 sock gnomes. Not to mention that once the sock gnomes actually land on their target, you just have to wait for them to decrease their health bar. This isn't a huge deal in combat since you can just focus on other enemies, but when they are last ones, it is somewhat annoying. It's a small nitpick though. Although this nitpick becomes a bigger problem for a later enemy who also requires the sock gnomes. This enemy, the Speedo wearer, is not stun locked while being attacked by sock gnomes, so he can continue fighting you and all you can do is wait for his health bar to drain. Anyway, putting a tourist, especially more than one of them, in a room is a guaranteed way to slow down the flow of the game. Some other late game enemies are problematic for me, specifically the aforementioned Speedo guy, the DJ, and the Flasher. The Speedo wearer has 2 health bars and requires 2 different weapons to defeat. The tailor-made fabric grenade, which you must fire and wait and then shoot with the primary fire to retail his clothes, along with also throwing 2 sock gnomes his way. He has a close range attack where he whips you with his towel that is, as far as I know, not possible to dodge other than being out of range. He can also jump around and land with a radius of damage. The DJ buffs all surrounding enemies and has a fairly large amount of health. Honestly, I can't tell if the DJ and Flamer both have too much health or if the water cannon just sucks, but nonetheless, they both take a little too long to kill in my opinion. Also, I legitimately do not understand how to consistently dodge her effect other than standing on a particularly tall object off of the ground. It seems you should be able to time a jump, but I can't seem to do so. I may just suck. Finding a safe place to get away from the damage is a cool mechanic, but it is fairly hard to do when I'm also getting pummeled from other enemies. Okay, the Flasher is a bit of a nitpick because I do like the idea that he could require one gun or another and it's random, but just the fact you have to wait to do damage to him and then he can cover back up and you have to wait again is just annoying. Again, it just slows things down. The Neon Bra enemies were enjoyable in the beginning of the game, but when there are multiple coupled with other enemies, they quickly become unfun for me as they knock you around, and because they're so fast, they're hard to take out. This is another small thing for me just because I generally like to move as fast as possible and be essentially unimpeded. There's also the Gimp enemies, which are another enemy to slow you down, so of course I'm not a big fan. The fact that they will teleport to your Belt of Justice whip can be annoying because they purposely put them with sagging pants enemies, but at least it makes sense, so I won't complain. I know it kinda seems like I find essentially every enemy annoying, which is not really true, but even the enemies I have specifically pointed out are generally fine. I like a lot of the mechanic ideas, they just get overwhelming or downright unfun when everything is put together. Honestly, around level 11 or 12, of which there are 13, the only thing pulling me through was the plot, which I did want to see the conclusion of, and the fact that I wanted to make this video. If it were not for those things, I would have stopped at level 10 for sure, as that is where the difficulty spiked to a ridiculous degree. Before that though, I had a good amount of fun. The only other big thing I can think of to complain about was the platforming. I enjoy good platforming. Even in a so-called boomer shooter, that does not inherently bother me. However, I found the water cannon speed jumping mechanic to be fairly inconsistent or just hard to get the hang of, although I eventually did, pretty much. I also found some of the bouncy objects to be a little inconsistent as well. Unfortunately, I have a lot more to say about the things I do not like than the things I do. Based on my ranting over boomer shooters, it probably seems I do not recommend this game, which is not the case. I'll try to list out some things I very much like about the game all the way through. The Belt of Justice is a lot of fun. I quite enjoy secondary functions because I do not have to take the time to switch weapons and I still get a useful mechanic. Not only this, but the platforming with the belt is actually a blast. There are a few sequences that are particularly fun. I like the sniping sequence during the fashion show, and I think that this is the perfect use of strategy shooter elements. I also quite liked the car chase, that was genuinely very fun. The bosses haven't been my favorite parts of the game, but bosses in first-person shooters can be hard to pull off, and with that under consideration, I think Fashion Police Squad did a very very good job. Perhaps this was a given, but I do like the art style quite a lot. The enemies being sprites isn't what I usually see, and for me at least, requires more effort than 3D models. Although I am more of a 3D modeler than anything else, so maybe that's just me. The gun designs are also pretty cool. Obviously I mentioned this a while back at the beginning of the video, but I thoroughly enjoy the creativity that this game exudes. Weapons, enemies, plot, dialogue, everything. It is creative and often quite humorous. It is obvious that a lot of thought was put into the theme of the game, which makes it hard not to support. That being said, I think a little bit of that thought could have been redirected into the gameplay in the later parts of the game. I think most of the enemies are pretty fun on their own, but once you deal with a few different types at a time, it is just not fun for me. I'm sure there are people watching this and thinking that I'm just bad at the game, and maybe so, but there are two different kinds of difficulty. A challenge that I want to complete because it's still fun and feels rewarding, and a frustrating annoyance that I begrudgingly deal with. Unfortunately, the latter would be true for the end of this game. The beginning of the game was not particularly challenging. I'm pretty sure I didn't die a single time until mission 6, and then not again until mission 10. Overall, I would give this game a 6 out of 10. I simply cannot ignore how this game comes apart for me towards the last quarter or so. That being said, that still makes room for well over half of the game to be a fun playthrough. It has some fundamental problems that I think could be fixed with better enemy design, but on a small scale, the enemy behaviors are still creative and fun. Sure, the platforming mechanics can be a little inconsistent, but I also cannot ignore the sheer care and thought that was put into the story and theming for the game. For me, Fashion Police Squad has a lot of pros and cons, and I'm not sure if I've even fully made up my mind on it yet. As of writing this, I have not yet completed the final boss of the game, but I'll probably get back to it soon. My advice would be to check Fashion Police Squad out for yourself. I do not think it's for everyone, but I also think a lot of people could really enjoy it. I wouldn't pick it up for any more than 15 bucks though. I personally got it at 30% off. It took me 5 hours to get to the final boss, so I'm not sure that it warrants 20 bucks, but to be honest, I rarely buy things at full price. I imagine this is the kind of game that a lot of people start and get through a majority of only to never come back to. Still, I would suggest checking this insanely cheesy game out. If you're an indie game dev watching this and have a game on Steam you would like me to talk about, let us know. You could comment down below or DM us on Instagram. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next indie highlight.